Later on in the dialogue, Socrates talks more explicitly about knowledge and recalls at one point on page 90, hey, this reminds me of Daedalus's statues. Daedalus was a legendary figure in Greek life, and he was known, among other things, for his ability to create incredibly lifelike statues. And in fact, they were so lifelike that they would sometimes get up and walk away or run away. And so Socrates points out that Daedalus' statues were so lifelike that they would sometimes even come to life, and unless you tied them down, they would tend to run away. And now Socrates wants to suggest as well that there's a sense in which, if we're trying to figure out what knowledge is, we should distinguish between having a true opinion and having knowledge. So let's try to figure out what knowledge is in a more general way. To know something, that thing you know has to be true. That is, I can't know something if it's not the case. People often say things like the following: I knew I was going to win, the lottery say, but I lost. All they mean there is that they were certain that they were going to win, but I believe they're misusing the word know in that context. That is to say, knowledge, knowing something requires it to be true, but I also have to believe it. There are lots of things that are true, lots of propositions or statements that are true that I know nothing about, that don't count as any part of my knowledge. So to know something, it's got to be true, and I've got to believe it. So far, we've got what Socrates would call a true opinion. But now the question is true opinion, is having a belief, and having that belief be true enough to be counting as knowledge? Well, surely not, Socrates will say, and we can see why. So, for example, suppose that in the student union one day, a student organization is having a big giveaway for anybody who can guess the right number of jelly beans they've got in a very large jar. Huge jar right in the center of the student union. And they say, if you can guess the number of jelly beans inside that jar, you'll be able to go take Jonathan the Husky home with you for a weekend and take him for walks and play with him, and then you'll perhaps get a box seat in a football game that's coming up soon. Sounds great. So we go to the student union, and everybody puts in their number. They write down their number on the slip, and I guess, oh, I don't know, how about 12,964? And I get a letter the next day, you were right. You win the prize. You get to go home with Jonathan, et cetera, to which I say, great. I'm glad I won the prize, but that would not count as knowing how many jelly beans were in the jar. I just got lucky. A lucky guess is not knowledge. So too, Socrates wants to say, there are many true opinions, but the true opinions are liable to run away in the following sense. They're not tied down with an answer to the question, how do I know? What justifies my belief? What is the source or basis for my belief? An answer to the question, how do you know that there are 12,964? If someone were to challenge me before I put that slip in the voting booth, so to speak, I might say, I don't know, it's just a guess. I hope I win. Tying down a true opinion is a matter of giving an account. That is to say, of being able to say, well, suppose I had snuck in the night before and counted the jelly beans, poured them all out on the floor, counted them one by one, finally got to 12,964. Now I'd be able to justify my claim that there were that many. That would count as knowledge. That would count as tying down. Another way to see this is the following. If I have just true opinion, then had the number of jelly beans in the jar been different, I would still have put in the same answer, 12,964. That is to say, a guess is not sensitive to different ways things might have been. Whereas if I have knowledge then, for example, because I counted them last night, then the answer that I put on the sheet of paper would be different depending upon what I counted. So the idea is that tying down a bit of knowledge, tying down a true belief so that it becomes knowledge, requires being sensitive to different things that might have been the case. That's what philosophers like to call counterfactual sensitivity. And what Socrates is suggesting is that in order to have a justification for my belief, that view of mine, my belief, has to be sensitive to different ways things might have been. Had the world been one way, I would have had one view. Had the world been a different way, I would have had a different view. That's the appropriate kind of justification that Socrates is looking for. And we often ask ourselves, how do we know? You will often ask your friends, how do you know when they make a claim, especially if it's a surprising claim, and you should expect them to come back to you and say, well, here's how I know. And that answer should provide evidence that had things in the world been different, their view of it would have been appropriately sensitive to it as well, would have responded to that difference too. So true opinion is a belief that happens to be true, but knowledge is true opinion plus what Socrates would call an account, what we might nowadays call justification. An answer to the question, how do you know, that allows us to show that one's belief is rational and not just arbitrarily held. The slave boy that Socrates had a conversation with had true opinion, perhaps, somewhere inside of him, and that Socrates, by virtue of the process known as recollection, had caused the boy to bring up into consciousness and in the process also turn it into a kind of account, which made it be something like knowledge. But we've also wondered whether that's the only way of understanding how these things go.